Why medieval churches feared women so much. Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's most perplexing obsessions. The medieval church's systematic, centuries-long campaign of terror against half the human population. Not because they were dangerous, not because they were violent, but because they were women. From the church fathers who declared female biology a spiritual hazard to the elaborate rituals designed to protect holy men from feminine contamination, this is the story of institutional fear so deep it shaped law, medicine, and daily life for over 1,000 years. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're sitting in a cold stone cathedral in 1347, watching a woman approach the altar. But something's wrong. The priest immediately steps back, his face twisted in visible discomfort. The congregation murmurs disapprovingly. Children are pulled closer to their fathers. Everyone seems terrified, and not because she's armed or dangerous. She's just a woman, walking, breathing, existing in a sacred space during what the church calls her unclean time. And in that moment, you're witnessing one of history's most bizarre and systematic campaigns of fear, control, and theological gymnastics. Because for over 1,000 years, the medieval church didn't just disapprove of women. It was absolutely, fundamentally, cosmically terrified of them. This isn't just a story about sexism. It's about institutional fear so deep, so paranoid, so all-consuming, that it shaped everything from architecture to law to medicine. The medieval church's war against women wasn't fought with swords and shields. It was fought with doctrine and discrimination, purification rituals and theological treatises that declared half the human population essentially walking spiritual hazmat zones. And once you understand just how terrified these supposedly holy men were of the feminine, everything about the Middle Ages starts to make a lot more sense. Trust me, it gets weirder than you think. When Christianity first crawled out of the dusty corners of the Roman Empire, it didn't start with a comprehensive manual on why women were scary. That came later, much later, after centuries of increasingly nervous theologians decided that the biggest threat to salvation wasn't war, plague, or poverty, but menstruation. But let's rewind. Early Christianity was, believe it or not, relatively progressive about women. Jesus himself hung around with female disciples, talked to women publicly, and generally treated them like, well, people. Revolutionary stuff for the first century. Early Christian communities had female leaders, deacons, even some who might have been considered apostles. Women hosted house churches, funded missions, and played active roles in spreading the faith. But then something changed. As Christianity grew from a scrappy underground movement into the official religion of the Roman Empire, it started absorbing the cultural baggage of its new environment. And Roman culture, for all its engineering prowess and military efficiency, had some deeply complicated feelings about women. Add to that mix a heavy dose of Greek philosophical tradition, which had been insisting for centuries that women were basically defective men, and you've got the perfect recipe for theological disaster. The real turning point came with the Church Fathers, a collection of early Christian thinkers who spent an alarming amount of time obsessing over female biology. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 400s, declared that women were made in God's image only when united with their husbands. Alone, apparently, they didn't quite make the cut. Jerome, the scholar who translated the Bible into Latin, spent years ranting about the dangers of female company, warning monks that even looking at a woman could damn their souls. And then there was John Chrysostom, who cheerfully announced that women were by nature inferior, weak, and prone to deception. These weren't fringe opinions from bitter hermits living in caves. These were the official theological positions of men whose writings would shape Christian doctrine for the next 1,000 years. They took the story of Eve, the first woman who supposedly brought sin into the world by eating forbidden fruit, and turned it into a comprehensive theory of female spiritual contamination. Women weren't just potentially dangerous. They were walking reminders of humanity's fall from grace, ticking time bombs of temptation and corruption. But here's where it gets really strange. The church fathers didn't just declare women spiritually inferior and call it a day. They became obsessed with the mechanics of how that inferiority worked. They wanted to understand exactly why God had made women so dangerous, and more importantly, how to protect holy men from female contamination. The result was centuries of increasingly bizarre theological speculation about female bodies, minds, and souls that would make a modern conspiracy theorist blush. By the time the Roman Empire collapsed and Europe entered what we call the Middle Ages, the Church had already laid the groundwork for institutional misogyny on an unprecedented scale. Women weren't just second-class citizens. They were potential threats to the cosmic order itself, and the Church was going to spend the next millennium making sure everyone knew it. The medieval Church's fear of women wasn't just philosophical. It was visceral, immediate, and centered on one particular aspect of female biology that made medieval clerics break out in cold sweats: menstruation. To understand just how terrified medieval Christianity was of women, you have to understand that for over 1,000 years, the Church taught that menstruating women were literally, physically, spiritually toxic. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually toxic. This wasn't some fringe belief held by a few extremist monks. This was official church doctrine, written into canon law, preached from pulpits, and enforced with the full weight of ecclesiastical authority. The Levitical laws of the Old Testament declared menstruating women unclean, and medieval theologians took that ball and ran with it all the way to the theological end zone. According to official church teaching, a menstruating woman couldn't touch holy objects, couldn't enter sacred spaces, couldn't receive communion, and definitely couldn't come anywhere near a priest performing sacred rituals. But it got worse. Medieval medical texts, heavily influenced by church doctrine, claimed that menstrual blood was not just spiritually contaminating but physically poisonous. Physicians warned that it could wilt plants, sour wine, crack mirrors, and even kill small animals. Some treatises claimed that looking directly at a menstruating woman could cause blindness, and that her touch could rust iron and spoil food. It was like medieval clerics had convinced themselves that half the human population spent a quarter of their adult lives as walking biological weapons. The Church developed elaborate purification rituals for women who had the audacity to menstruate. After her period ended, a woman had to wait a specific number of days, undergo ritual cleansing, and make offerings before she could participate in religious life again. These weren't gentle suggestions. They were mandatory, enforceable religious laws with serious consequences for violation. Churches employed special officials whose job was to monitor women's cycles and ensure compliance with purity laws. Imagine that career counseling session. Parish priests were given detailed instructions on how to question women about their menstrual status before allowing them to receive sacraments. Confessional manuals included specific questions about feminine hygiene, and priests were trained to recognize the signs of female uncleanness. Some churches even maintained separate seating areas for women who might be menstruating, just in case their spiritual contamination was contagious. The economic impact was significant too. Women couldn't work in certain trades during their periods, couldn't handle food preparation in religious contexts, and were often excluded from important community events. In some regions, menstruating women couldn't attend markets, participate in legal proceedings, or even touch tools used by others. It was systematic segregation based on biological functions, enforced by religious authority and justified by theological paranoia. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of menstrual taboos was how they were internalized by women themselves. Generations of women grew up believing that their natural biological processes made them spiritually inferior and physically dangerous. They learned to feel shame about their own bodies, to see menstruation as punishment for Eve's sin, and to accept exclusion from religious and social life as natural and necessary. The church had managed to convince half the population that they were born with a monthly curse that made them unfit for full participation in society. This wasn't just misogyny. This was misogyny elevated to the level of cosmic principle, enforced by divine mandate, and applied with bureaucratic precision. And menstruation was just the beginning. The medieval church had plenty more reasons to be afraid of women. While the church was busy declaring menstruation a spiritual biohazard, it was simultaneously grappling with an even more complex problem. Sex. Not just the act itself, though that certainly kept medieval theologians up at night, but the entire concept of female sexuality. Because according to medieval church doctrine, women were simultaneously sexless virgin ideals and uncontrollable engines of lust. Make that make sense. The church had painted itself into a theological corner. On one hand, they held up the Virgin Mary as the perfect woman, pure, chaste, and miraculously untouched by sexual desire. She was the model all women should aspire to emulate. On the other hand, they taught that women were descendants of Eve, naturally inclined toward sin, and possessed of sexual appetites so powerful they could corrupt the most dedicated holy men. The cognitive dissonance was spectacular. Medieval theologians resolved this contradiction by deciding that all women were basically broken versions of Mary. They had the potential for perfect purity, but their fallen nature made them constantly susceptible to sexual temptation. This meant that female sexuality was not just dangerous to women themselves, but to everyone around them. A sexually active woman wasn't just sinning. She was actively participating in spiritual warfare on the side of Satan. The church developed an entire taxonomy of female sexual threats. There were the obvious ones, prostitutes and adulteresses who were engaging in clearly prohibited behavior. But there were also more subtle categories. Married women who enjoyed sex too much were suspect. Widows who remarried were viewed with suspicion. Even nuns who seemed a little too friendly with their confessor could find themselves under investigation. The church was constantly on guard against female sexuality breaking containment and contaminating the spiritual atmosphere. This paranoia led to some truly bizarre practices. Monasteries developed elaborate protocols for interactions between monks and women. Some orders required multiple witnesses to be present whenever a monk spoke to a female visitor. Others mandated that conversations take place through grilled windows or with physical barriers. Some monasteries refused to allow women on the premises at all, viewing the mere presence of females as spiritually dangerous. The church also became obsessed with regulating marital sexuality. Canon law dictated exactly when married couples could have sex, which positions were acceptable, and what motivations were permissible. Sex for pleasure was sinful. Sex during Lent was forbidden. Sex during menstruation was abhorrent. Sex on Sundays or holy days was sacrilegious. By the time medieval moralists finished making their lists, there were only about 3 days a month when married couples could have intercourse without committing sin. But the real terror was reserved for unmarried female sexuality. Single women who had sexual relationships were viewed as walking spiritual contamination zones. They couldn't be trusted around holy objects, sacred spaces, or celibate clergy. Some church leaders argued that sexually active unmarried women should be physically marked or segregated from the community to protect others from their corrupting influence. The church's fear of female sexuality reached its logical extreme in the treatment of alleged witches. When medieval authorities wanted to prove that a woman was in league with Satan, sexual deviance was often the first thing they looked for. Witch trial records are filled with accusations of unnatural sexual practices, supernatural seduction, and demonic copulation. The church had convinced itself that female sexuality was so inherently dangerous that it must be connected to supernatural evil. This wasn't just prudishness or moral conservatism. This was systematic terror of female sexual agency, disguised as religious doctrine and enforced with the full weight of ecclesiastical law. The medieval church wasn't just trying to control women's bodies. It was trying to control the very idea that women might have desires, needs, or agency over their own sexuality. And it was willing to use every tool at its disposal to make sure that never happened. While medieval priests were developing increasingly elaborate theories about why women were spiritually dangerous, they ran into a practical problem. They needed women. Not personally, of course, that would be spiritually hazardous. But institutionally, the church depended on female labor, female donations, and female participation to function. The solution was to create a careful hierarchy of acceptable female roles, each designed to minimize the supposed dangers while maximizing the benefits. At the top of this hierarchy were nuns, women who had theoretically eliminated their threatening sexuality by taking vows of celibacy and submitting completely to church authority. Nuns were the closest thing to safe women in the medieval imagination. They had contained their dangerous feminine nature through ritual submission and constant supervision. But even nuns weren't entirely trusted. Convents were subject to regular inspections by male church officials, and nuns were required to confess to male priests who could monitor their spiritual condition for signs of feminine backsliding. The church developed strict regulations for nun behavior that revealed just how little trust medieval clergy had in female religious devotion. Nuns couldn't leave their convents without permission. They couldn't receive visitors without supervision. They couldn't handle money, make decisions about convent property, or communicate with the outside world without oversight. Even their prayers were monitored. Some convents required nuns to pray with their hands visible at all times to ensure they weren't engaging in inappropriate touching during religious observances. Below nuns in the hierarchy of acceptable women were the wives of laymen, women who had channeled their dangerous sexuality into legitimate reproduction under proper male supervision. Married women were spiritually safer than single women because their sexuality was contained within the bounds of holy matrimony, but they still required careful management. Canon law gave husbands extensive authority over their wives' religious lives. A wife couldn't take religious vows, make pilgrimages, or even give substantial donations to the church without her husband's permission. The church also recognized a category of women known as religious recluses or anchoresses, females who voluntarily walled themselves into small cells attached to churches and spent their lives in prayer and meditation. These women were considered spiritually superior to ordinary wives because they had eliminated almost all contact with the corrupting world. Some anchoresses were literally bricked into their cells in elaborate ceremonies that resembled funeral rites, symbolically dying to the world and being reborn as pure spiritual beings. The church loved these women because they had solved the problem of feminine danger by essentially ceasing to exist as social beings. At the bottom of the hierarchy were all the other women, the unmarried, the widowed, the sexually active, the economically independent, and anyone else who didn't fit neatly into church-approved categories. These women were viewed with constant suspicion and subjected to regular monitoring by local church officials. Parish priests were required to keep track of unmarried women in their communities, monitor their behavior for signs of sexual impropriety, and report suspicious activities to higher authorities. The church also developed a complex system of female lay religious roles that allowed women to participate in religious life while maintaining strict oversight. There were tertiaries, women who took modified religious vows while remaining in the world. There were begins, women who lived in semi-religious communities without formal vows. There were ancillary orders of nuns who performed specific services under direct clerical supervision. Each of these roles was carefully designed to channel female religious enthusiasm in ways that minimize the perceived dangers of uncontrolled feminine spirituality. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the church's approach to women was how it handled female religious leadership. Women could be abbesses, but only under the ultimate authority of male bishops. They could teach, but only other women and only approved subjects. They could prophesy, but only after their visions had been verified by male theologians. They could write, but only if their works were supervised and approved by male clerics. The church wanted to benefit from female spiritual gifts while ensuring that women never gained independent religious authority. This elaborate system of feminine containment reveals just how terrified medieval Christianity was of uncontrolled female agency. The church wasn't just trying to manage women's behavior. It was trying to manage the very possibility that women might have direct access to divine truth without male mediation. The fear wasn't just that women were spiritually dangerous. The fear was that they might not need male religious authority at all. All of this institutional paranoia about feminine contamination might have remained a purely theoretical problem if the medieval church had been content to write worried treatises and develop elaborate purification rituals. But theory has a way of becoming practice, especially when backed by institutional power and religious authority. The church's fear of women didn't just shape theology. It shaped law, medicine, daily life, and ultimately it led to some of the darkest chapters in European history. The most obvious manifestation of ecclesiastical misogyny was the legal system. Medieval law codes, heavily influenced by church doctrine, systematically disadvantaged women in virtually every aspect of life. Women couldn't own property independently, couldn't make contracts without male approval, couldn't testify in court on equal terms with men, and couldn't hold most positions of civil authority. These weren't just social customs. They were legal requirements backed by the full weight of both secular and religious law. But the church's influence went beyond formal legal discrimination. Canon law, the internal legal system of the church itself, was filled with provisions that treated women as inherently unreliable witnesses, spiritually compromised decision-makers, and potential sources of contamination. When secular courts needed guidance on moral or spiritual matters, they turned to church law, which meant that ecclesiastical misogyny was constantly being translated into civil legal precedent. The medical profession, dominated by clerics or heavily influenced by church doctrine, absorbed and amplified religious fears about feminine biology. Medieval medical texts claimed that women's bodies were fundamentally different from men's, not just in obvious ways, but in their basic spiritual and physical properties. Physicians taught that women were naturally colder, moister, and more prone to corruption than men. They claimed that female anatomy made women inherently irrational, emotionally unstable, and susceptible to supernatural influence. These medical theories had serious practical consequences. Women's testimony about their own health was often dismissed as unreliable. Female pain was frequently attributed to moral failing rather than physical causes. pregnancy, and childbirth were seen as naturally dangerous processes that women deserved to suffer through as punishment for Eve's sin. Medical treatment for women often involved spiritual as well as physical intervention, because physicians believed that female ailments were likely to have supernatural causes. The Church's fear of women also shaped education and intellectual life. Women were systematically excluded from universities, which were originally ecclesiastical institutions designed to train clergy. They were forbidden from studying theology, philosophy, and law, subjects considered too dangerous for feminine minds. Even literacy was viewed with suspicion when it came to women. Church authorities worried that women who could read might access religious texts without proper male supervision and develop unauthorized spiritual ideas. But perhaps the most devastating manifestation of ecclesiastical misogyny was the way it prepared the ground for the great witch hunts of the later medieval and early modern periods. The Church had spent centuries teaching that women were naturally inclined toward spiritual corruption, susceptible to demonic influence, and dangerous to the moral order. When Europe began experiencing social upheaval, economic crisis, and religious reformation, it was almost inevitable that women would be blamed. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, was the logical culmination of centuries of ecclesiastical paranoia about feminine danger. The authors argued that women were naturally more susceptible to witchcraft because of their inferior intelligence, uncontrolled sexuality, and spiritual weakness. They claimed that female nature made women perfect recruits for Satan's war against God, and that the only way to protect Christian society was through systematic identification and elimination of female threats. The witch hunts that followed weren't just random outbreaks of popular hysteria. They were systematic campaigns of gender-based persecution, organized and legitimized by religious authorities who had been teaching for centuries that women were inherently dangerous. The same Church that had declared menstruation spiritually toxic and female sexuality a threat to salvation now declared that thousands of women were literally in league with Satan. The scale of the persecution was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe between 1450 and 1750, with women comprising roughly 75 to 80% of the victims. In some regions, the percentage was even higher. Entire communities were devastated as accusations spread like wildfire, fueled by centuries of religious teaching that had prepared people to see women as potential agents of supernatural evil. The witch hunts weren't just the result of medieval superstition or popular ignorance. They were the logical outcome of institutional misogyny that had been developing for centuries under religious authority. The Church had created the intellectual framework that made mass persecution of women seem not just reasonable, but necessary for spiritual survival. And when social pressures made scapegoats necessary, women were the obvious choice because religious authority had already declared them inherently dangerous. This wasn't an accident or an unintended consequence. This was the predictable result of an institution that had spent over 1,000 years teaching that half the human population was fundamentally corrupted, spiritually contaminated, and dangerous to the divine order. The medieval Church's fear of women didn't just shape religious doctrine. It laid the groundwork for some of history's most systematic gender-based persecution. While the Church was busy developing elaborate theories about why women were spiritually dangerous, history had an inconvenient habit of producing women who refused to conform to those theories. Female saints, mystics, scholars, and leaders kept appearing, often demonstrating levels of spiritual insight and religious authority that made male church officials deeply uncomfortable. The Church's response was to create a special category of exceptional women, who could be celebrated as proof of divine power while being used to reinforce the supposed inferiority of ordinary females. The cult of the Virgin Mary was the Church's masterpiece of feminine theological manipulation. Mary was held up as the perfect woman, but her perfection was defined by characteristics that were literally impossible for any other woman to achieve. She was simultaneously virgin and mother, pure and fertile, submissive and powerful. Mary's perfection wasn't something other women could aspire to. It was something that emphasized how far short all other women fell from divine approval. The Church used Mary's example to create an impossible standard for feminine behavior. Real women were expected to be as pure as a virgin while fulfilling their reproductive duties as wives and mothers. They were supposed to be as humble as Mary, while somehow managing households and raising children. They were expected to be spiritually superior to men while remaining intellectually and socially subordinate. It was theological gaslighting on a massive scale. Female saints provided another mechanism for managing the problem of exceptional women. The Church was perfectly willing to celebrate women who demonstrated extraordinary spiritual gifts, but only after those women had been safely dead for decades and their stories had been carefully edited to emphasize submission to male authority. Saints like Catherine of Siena, who had significant political influence during her lifetime, were posthumously transformed into models of humble obedience who never challenged church hierarchy. Living holy women were much more problematic. Medieval Europe produced numerous female mystics who claimed direct revelation from God, and their popularity with ordinary believers made them impossible to ignore. But their claims to divine communication bypassed the Church's monopoly on spiritual authority, which made male clerics extremely nervous. The Church's solution was to insist that all female mystical experiences be verified and interpreted by male theologians before being accepted as legitimate. This created a bizarre system where women were encouraged to seek mystical experiences, but forbidden from interpreting them independently. Female visionaries were subjected to intensive interrogation by male church officials who would determine whether their visions came from God, the devil, or simple feminine hysteria. Women who claimed divine revelation without male approval were often declared heretics or accused of witchcraft. Women who submitted to male interpretation were celebrated as examples of proper feminine spirituality. The Church also developed the concept of spiritual marriage to manage women who demonstrated exceptional religious gifts. Female mystics were encouraged to see themselves as brides of Christ, which allowed them to claim a special relationship with God while emphasizing their essential femininity and sexual identity. Even their highest spiritual achievements were defined in terms of their role as women and their relationship to male divine authority. Scholarly women presented another challenge to church authority. Medieval Europe produced female intellectuals like Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote extensively on theology, medicine, and natural philosophy. But their scholarly work was always qualified by references to their feminine humility and their submission to male theological authority. Hildegard's writings were accepted because she claimed to receive her knowledge through divine revelation rather than independent study, which made her scholarship seem like feminine receptivity rather than masculine intellectual achievement. The Church's handling of exceptional women reveals the depth of its institutional misogyny. Even when women demonstrated obvious spiritual gifts, intellectual ability, or leadership skills, the Church found ways to interpret their achievements as confirmation of feminine inferiority rather than evidence against it. Exceptional women weren't proof that church teachings about feminine nature were wrong. They were proof that God could work miracles even through fundamentally flawed feminine instruments. This theological sleight of hand allowed the Church to have it both ways. They could celebrate female spiritual achievements while maintaining that women were naturally inferior to men. They could benefit from female religious enthusiasm while insisting that women needed male supervision. They could acknowledge feminine holiness while denying women independent spiritual authority. It was a brilliant system that turned every example of female competence into an argument for male supremacy. Perhaps most insidiously, this approach convinced many women to participate in their own subjugation. Exceptional women learned to present their achievements as evidence of divine grace, working through feminine weakness rather than as proof of their own abilities. They internalized the Church's message that their successes were miraculous exceptions that proved the rule of feminine inferiority. The Church had managed to turn even female excellence into an argument for female subordination, but the system wasn't perfect. Some women saw through the theological manipulation and challenged church authority directly. These women were labeled heretics, witches, or simply dangerous troublemakers, and the Church used every tool at its disposal to suppress them. Because the one thing the medieval Church couldn't tolerate was women who refused to accept that their exceptional abilities were actually evidence of their essential inferiority. The medieval Church's war on women wasn't fought only in theological treatises and canon law. It played out in the daily lives of millions of ordinary women who found themselves navigating a world where their basic biological functions were considered spiritually dangerous, and their social participation was constantly monitored and restricted. The practical effects of institutional misogyny shaped everything from architecture to agriculture to family life. Consider the simple act of attending church. For medieval women, religious observance was a minefield of potential contamination and exclusion. They couldn't attend services during menstruation. They couldn't approach the altar during certain times of the month. They were often required to sit in separate sections, sometimes behind screens or barriers that prevented them from seeing the most sacred parts of the liturgy. Even when permitted to attend, they couldn't participate fully in religious rituals. The economic impact was enormous. Women were excluded from most craft guilds, which controlled access to skilled trades and economic advancement. They couldn't enter contracts independently, own property in their own names, or conduct business without male supervision. When widowed, women often found themselves stripped of assets that passed to male relatives or returned to their deceased husbands' families. The Church's teaching that women were naturally inferior and unreliable provided religious justification for systematic economic discrimination. Marriage itself became a theological battlefield where church doctrine collided with human reality. The Church taught that sex was primarily for reproduction and that pleasure was sinful, but it also insisted that spouses owed each other conjugal rights. Women were supposed to be submissive to their husbands in all things, but they were also expected to resist if their husbands demanded sinful sexual practices. The Church created detailed rules about marital sexuality that were nearly impossible to follow, then blamed women when those rules were violated. Pregnancy and childbirth were particularly fraught with religious implications. The Church taught that labor pain was punishment for Eve's sin, and that women deserved to suffer during delivery. Pain relief was often considered interference with the divine justice. Women who died in childbirth were sometimes denied full funeral rites because their deaths were seen as evidence of spiritual failing. Mothers who survived difficult deliveries were required to undergo purification rituals before they could resume religious participation. Even infant care was shaped by ecclesiastical misogyny. The Church taught that babies inherited spiritual contamination from their mothers and required immediate baptism to prevent damnation. Mothers were considered spiritually dangerous to their own children until they had been purified after childbirth. Breastfeeding was viewed with suspicion because it involved continued physical connection between spiritually contaminated mothers and innocent infants. Some church authorities recommended wet nurses to minimize maternal spiritual influence on newborns. The church's fear of women also shaped domestic architecture and social arrangements. Houses were designed with separate spaces for women during menstruation. Churches included special areas where women could be segregated during their unclean periods. Convents were built like fortresses to contain the supposed dangers of uncontrolled feminine spirituality. Even ordinary homes reflected religious teachings about the need to monitor and control female behavior. Legal proceedings became exercises in institutionalized discrimination. Women's testimony was automatically considered less reliable than men's. Female plaintiffs faced additional requirements to prove their credibility. Women accused of crimes were often assumed guilty because church teaching suggested they were naturally inclined towards sin. The legal system routinely accepted domestic violence as necessary correction of feminine misbehavior, and rape was often blamed on female temptation rather than male criminality. Education was systematically denied to women based on church teachings about feminine intellectual inferiority. Girls were taught basic household skills and religious obedience, but were excluded from formal learning that might give them intellectual independence. The few women who did receive education were constantly reminded that their learning was exceptional and shouldn't make them prideful or challenging to male authority. Perhaps most devastating was the psychological impact of living under constant religious surveillance and condemnation. Women internalized messages about their spiritual inferiority, natural sinfulness, and inherent danger to others. They learned to feel shame about their bodies, their desires, and their basic human needs. They accepted exclusion and discrimination as divinely ordained and often participated in enforcing restrictions on other women. The church had created a system where women policed each other's behavior according to male-designed standards of feminine acceptability. Mothers taught daughters to be ashamed of menstruation. Wives monitored neighbors for signs of sexual impropriety. Nuns reported suspicious behavior by their sisters to male authorities. The institution had managed to turn women into enforcers of their own oppression. This wasn't just individual prejudice or cultural conservatism. This was systematic dehumanization disguised as religious doctrine and implemented through every institution that touched medieval life. The church's fear of women didn't just affect religious practice. It corrupted law, medicine, education, economics, and family life in ways that would persist for centuries and continue to influence Western attitudes toward women long after the medieval period ended. The medieval church's elaborate system of feminine containment and theological justification for misogyny didn't emerge in a vacuum. It developed in response to what male religious authorities perceived as an existential threat to their power and to the entire structure of medieval society. Women kept insisting on participating in religious life, developing spiritual insights, claiming divine authority, and generally refusing to accept that their biology made them spiritually inferior. The church's fear of women was really fear of losing control over the narrative of spiritual authority. Throughout the medieval period, women created alternative forms of religious expression that bypassed official church hierarchy. The Beguine movement, which spread across medieval Europe, consisted of women who lived in religious communities without formal vows and without male supervision. These women supported themselves through various forms of work, cared for the sick and poor, and developed their own forms of spiritual practice. They were essentially creating parallel religious institutions that didn't depend on male clerical authority. The church's response was predictably hostile. Beguines were repeatedly investigated for heresy, their communities were disbanded, and their leaders were often prosecuted as dangerous troublemakers. Church authorities claimed that women living together without male supervision would inevitably fall into sin, develop heretical ideas, and corrupt the broader community. The real threat was that Beguines demonstrated that women could organize successful religious communities without male control. Female mystics posed another challenge to ecclesiastical authority. Women like Mechtilde of Magdeburg, Julian of Norwich, and Marguerite Poreta claimed direct communication with God and wrote extensively about their spiritual experiences. Their writings often contained theological insights that rivaled or exceeded those of formally trained male clerics. Worse, their mystical experiences sometimes included visions that contradicted official church teaching or suggested that formal religious education wasn't necessary for spiritual understanding. The Church tried to contain female mysticism by insisting that all revelations be verified by male theologians and by emphasizing that mystical experiences were gifts of divine grace rather than achievements of feminine spiritual insight. But the popularity of female mystics with ordinary believers made them difficult to suppress entirely. Women's spiritual writings circulated widely and influenced religious thought in ways that male authorities couldn't control. Perhaps most threatening were women who directly challenged church authority by claiming religious leadership roles. Female preachers appeared throughout medieval Europe, attracting followers and developing religious movements that operated outside official church control. Some claimed prophetic authority that superseded clerical hierarchy. Others argued that spiritual gifts were more important than formal ordination. A few went so far as to suggest that the institutional church had become so corrupted by worldly concerns that it had lost its divine mandate. These women were systematically persecuted as heretics, but their persistence revealed the fundamental weakness in the church's position. If spiritual authority really came from God, and if God sometimes chose to work through women, then the church's claim to monopolize religious leadership was questionable. The existence of spiritually gifted women suggested that divine approval didn't necessarily correlate with male gender, formal education, or institutional position. The church's response was to develop increasingly elaborate explanations for why authentic female spirituality was impossible without male mediation. They claimed that women's spiritual experiences were inherently unreliable because of feminine emotional instability. They argued that female mystical visions required male interpretation because women lacked the intellectual capacity to understand divine communication. They insisted that female religious leadership was dangerous because women's inferior rational abilities made them susceptible to satanic deception. But the most revealing aspect of the church's fear was how it intensified whenever women gained any form of independence or authority. Female religious communities that became wealthy or influential were subjected to increased scrutiny and regulation. Women who attracted large followings were investigated for heretical teaching. Female scholars who challenged theological orthodoxy were accused of pride and spiritual rebellion. The pattern was clear. The church could tolerate female spirituality only when it remained subordinate to male authority. The witch hunts of the later medieval and early modern periods represented the logical culmination of centuries of ecclesiastical paranoia about feminine spiritual authority. When faced with social upheaval and religious challenge, church authorities found it convenient to blame supernatural feminine evil. The same theological framework that had been used to justify everyday discrimination against women was expanded to justify mass persecution of any woman who seemed too independent, too knowledgeable, or too influential. What the church really feared wasn't female biology or feminine sexuality. What they feared was the possibility that women might not need male religious authority at all. They feared that female spiritual experiences might be as valid as male ones, that feminine theological insights might be as valuable as masculine ones, and that women's claims to divine communication might be as authentic as men's. They feared, in other words, that their monopoly on spiritual authority was not divinely ordained, but artificially constructed. 8. The medieval church's systematic oppression of women wasn't just about controlling female behavior or maintaining social order. It was about preserving male institutional power by creating a theological justification for masculine supremacy. The church declared women inherently inferior because admitting female spiritual equality would have undermined the entire foundation of clerical authority. If women could access divine truth directly, if they could interpret Scripture independently, if they could lead religious communities successfully without male oversight, then what exactly was the point of an all-male priesthood? This fear became most apparent when the church faced actual challenges to its authority. During periods of religious revival or social change, women consistently emerged as leaders, prophets, and spiritual innovators. The church's response was always the same: co-opt, control, or destroy. Female religious movements were either absorbed into official church structures under male supervision, regulated into submission, or branded as heretical and eliminated. There was no fourth option because there couldn't be. Acknowledging independent female spiritual authority would have been institutional suicide. The economic dimensions of this fear were equally important. Medieval churches were massive economic institutions that controlled vast amounts of land, collected tithes, managed agricultural production, and operated complex financial networks. Women who gained religious authority often gained economic power as well. Abbesses controlled convent properties, female mystics attracted wealthy patrons, and women's religious movements generated significant donations. The church needed female economic participation but feared female economic independence. This created a constant tension between exploitation and control. The church wanted to benefit from women's labor, devotion, and financial contributions, while ensuring that women never gained enough power to challenge male authority. Convents were allowed to become wealthy, but their resources were ultimately controlled by male bishops. Female religious movements were permitted to flourish, but only under male supervision. Women could donate to the church, but they couldn't control how their donations were used. The intellectual implications were perhaps most threatening of all. Medieval women who gained access to education often demonstrated that female minds were perfectly capable of complex theological reasoning, sophisticated philosophical analysis, and innovative spiritual insight. This directly contradicted centuries of church teaching about feminine intellectual inferiority. Rather than acknowledge their error, church authorities developed elaborate explanations for why educated women were dangerous exceptions that proved the rule of feminine inadequacy. The church argued that women who demonstrated intellectual ability were either divinely inspired, which meant their achievements weren't really their own, or satanically influenced, which meant their intelligence was actually a form of spiritual corruption. Either way, female intellectual achievement was reframed as evidence supporting existing prejudices rather than challenging them. It was theological gaslighting of the highest order. But the most revealing aspect of the church's fear was how it responded to women who simply refused to be afraid. Throughout the medieval period, there were women who rejected the narrative of feminine inferiority, who claimed spiritual authority based on their own experiences, and who organized religious communities that operated independently of male control. These women were systematically persecuted, not because they were dangerous to society, but because they were dangerous to the church's monopoly on religious truth. The persecution of these women followed predictable patterns. First, they were dismissed as deluded or hysterical. When that didn't work, they were accused of pride or spiritual rebellion. If they continued to attract followers, they were investigated for heresy. If their movements grew too large or influential, They were declared demonic threats to Christian society and eliminated through legal prosecution, mob violence, or ecclesiastical condemnation. The witch hunts represented the ultimate expression of this pattern. When European society faced crisis and upheaval in the later medieval and early modern periods, the Church fell back on centuries of anti-female propaganda to identify scapegoats. Women who were too independent, too knowledgeable, too influential, or simply too inconvenient became targets of systematic persecution justified by theological arguments that had been developing for over 1,000 years. But even the witch hunts reveal the underlying weakness of the Church's position. The fact that thousands of women had to be killed to maintain masculine religious authority suggests that feminine spiritual independence was not the marginal phenomenon Church authorities claimed it to be. Women were not naturally submissive, intellectually inferior, or spiritually weak. They had to be made submissive through systematic oppression, convinced of their inferiority through constant propaganda, and weakened through deliberate exclusion from sources of power and knowledge. The medieval Church's fear of women was ultimately a fear of equality, not the modern concept of legal or political equality, but the much more basic recognition that women were human beings with the same spiritual capacities, intellectual potential, and moral agency as men. This recognition would have made the entire structure of medieval Christianity untenable, because it was built on the fundamental assumption that God had created a natural hierarchy with men at the top and women at the bottom. The theological implications of genuine gender equality would have been revolutionary. If women were spiritually equal to men, why couldn't they be priests? If women had the same intellectual capacities as men, why couldn't they study theology and interpret Scripture? If women had the same moral agency as men, why did they need male supervision and control? These questions threatened not just individual prejudices, but the entire institutional structure of medieval Christianity. The Church's response was to create an elaborate intellectual and institutional framework designed to prevent these questions from ever being seriously considered. Women were declared naturally inferior by divine design, which made questioning their subordination tantamount to questioning God Himself. Female spiritual experiences were deemed inherently unreliable, which made independent female religious authority impossible by definition. Women's intellectual achievements were reframed as either miraculous exceptions or demonic deceptions, which preserved the doctrine of feminine inferiority regardless of evidence to the contrary. This framework was remarkably successful for over 1,000 years. It convinced generations of women to accept their subordination as natural and divinely ordained. It provided religious justification for legal, economic, and social discrimination that persisted long after the medieval period ended. It created psychological patterns of feminine self-doubt and masculine entitlement that continue to influence Western culture today. But the framework also revealed its own weaknesses. The very elaborateness of the Church's anti-female theology suggests how much effort was required to maintain it. The constant vigilance against feminine spiritual independence indicates how persistent women's attempts at equality actually were. The severity of punishments for women who challenge Church authority demonstrates how seriously those challenges were taken. The medieval Church's war against women was ultimately a war against human nature itself. Despite centuries of systematic oppression, women continued to demonstrate spiritual insight, intellectual capacity, and moral courage. They continued to seek direct relationships with the divine, to develop independent religious communities, and to challenge masculine religious authority. The Church's fear of women was really fear of the indomitable human spirit that refuses to accept artificial limitations based on biological characteristics. Perhaps most significantly, The Church's systematic oppression of women created the conditions for its own eventual challenge. By denying women access to formal education, the Church inadvertently encouraged the development of alternative forms of learning and spiritual expression. By excluding women from official religious roles, the Church pushed female spiritual energy into unofficial channels that were harder to control. By declaring women naturally inferior, the Church created a standard of proof that some women were determined to disprove. The medieval Church's fear of women was not an abstract theological problem. It was a practical response to the real threat that female equality posed to masculine institutional power. The Church understood something that it could never admit publicly, that women were not naturally inferior to men, that female spiritual experiences were as valid as male ones, and that religious authority based solely on gender was fundamentally arbitrary and unjustifiable. This understanding explains both the sophistication and the desperation of medieval anti-female theology. The Church developed increasingly complex arguments for feminine inferiority because simple arguments were too easily disproven by actual female achievement. It created increasingly severe punishments for feminine independence because mild discouragement wasn't sufficient to suppress women's natural impulses toward equality and autonomy. The legacy of this systematic oppression extended far beyond the medieval period. The theological arguments developed by medieval churchmen provided intellectual justification for centuries of legal discrimination, economic exploitation, and social subordination. The psychological patterns created by constant religious condemnation shaped women's self-perception and men's attitudes toward female capacity for generations. But perhaps the most important legacy was the model it provided for institutional resistance to social change. The medieval Church demonstrated how powerful institutions could use religious authority, intellectual sophistication, and systematic propaganda to maintain unjust hierarchies even when those hierarchies contradicted both evidence and basic human values. It showed how fear of losing power could drive otherwise intelligent people to develop elaborate justifications for obviously irrational prejudices. The medieval Church's thousand-year war against women ultimately failed because it was based on false premises and sustained by artificial means. Women were not naturally inferior, spiritually weak, or intellectually limited. They were human beings whose capacities had been suppressed by systematic oppression disguised as divine mandate. When that oppression finally began to weaken, women's natural abilities reasserted themselves with a force that centuries of theological conditioning could not contain. The Church's fear of women was really fear of truth. The truth that gender-based hierarchy was a human invention rather than a divine command. The truth that spiritual authority came from character and calling rather than biological sex. The truth that intellectual capacity and moral worth were distributed equally among all human beings regardless of their anatomy. These truths were too dangerous for an institution built on masculine supremacy to acknowledge, so they had to be suppressed, denied, and actively fought against for over a millennium. But truth has a way of asserting itself despite institutional resistance. The medieval Church's elaborate theological edifice built to justify the oppression of women eventually crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. The women it tried so hard to silence eventually found their voices. The spiritual insights it tried to suppress eventually emerged. The equality it fought so desperately to prevent eventually began to prevail. The medieval Church's fear of women stands as one of history's most revealing examples of how institutional power responds to challenges to its authority. It shows us what happens when prejudice becomes policy, when fear becomes doctrine, and when the desire to maintain control overrides basic human decency. It reminds us that even the most sacred institutions are capable of systematic injustice when they prioritize their own power over the humanity of those they claim to serve. Most importantly, it demonstrates the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit in the face of systematic oppression. Despite centuries of religious condemnation, legal discrimination, and social exclusion, women continued to assert their humanity, claim their dignity, and demand their equality. They proved that no amount of theological sophistication could permanently suppress the fundamental human recognition that all people, regardless of gender, possess equal worth and capacity. The medieval church's war against women was ultimately a war against this recognition. It was doomed to fail because it fought against something more powerful than institutional authority, more enduring than religious doctrine, and more fundamental than masculine pride. It fought against truth itself. And in the end, truth won.